When people no longer fear the evil within themselves, all external ideals become empty rhetoric. An individual cannot be called strong if their inner self is still controlled by unconscious reactions. But how does one distinguish between a reaction and one's true self? What allows a person to maintain composure when attacked, clarity when misunderstood, and compassion even when hurt? Can a form of courage exist that doesn't require fighting anyone, winning against anyone, or standing above anyone? Can silence be a form of strength rather than a sign of surrender? And if such courage exists, where does it reside in the spiritual framework of modern humanity? The Courage of a Sage is a rare text in modern Vietnamese thought that meticulously and thoroughly explores these questions, not through lofty words or theories, but through a deeply introspective thought structure rarely seen, where the author is both a contemplator and one who has lived through silent yet fierce spiritual challenges. This is not a guide. It is a mirror, not for admiring oneself, but for seeing the parts of ourselves we'd rather not. And precisely in that act of seeing, another kind of courage begins to form. A courage that needs no weapons, no titles, only a state of mind that stands upright on its own. When all standards around us have begun to waver, now, let's summarize this book together. I used to think courage belonged to the battlefield, a place of swords, smoke, where people screamed to drown out the fear lurking behind their necks. But the more I lived, the more I realized there's a kind of courage that never speaks aloud. It doesn't require blood, or winning, or losing, yet it's the foundation for every right action. It's not the courage of someone holding a gun, but the courage of one who preserves their soul in the most chaotic times. That is the courage the ancients called the courage of a sage. This courage is not easily seen. It makes no noise, demands no attention. It often hides behind a very ordinary appearance, sometimes bland, even weak. But I've seen it, in a mother willing to endure her husband and children for years just to keep her home from falling apart. Seen in a teacher who dares to teach what is right, even knowing they'll be criticized, isolated. Seen in myself, in those times I wanted to retaliate but chose silence, understanding that words at that moment would only tear open wounds further. And it was from such instances that I began to ask, what truly constitutes a person's courage? Is it physical strength, outward boldness, or something more silent and resilient? I read books, history, even the countless anonymous stories that unfold daily in life. And then I encountered a concept that seemed small, but turned out to change my entire perspective on life: composure. A composed person is not hurried. They don't need to push to the front to prove their importance. They don't need to shout to demand respect. There's an admirable self-possession in such people. I once thought they were weak, but in reality, maintaining composure in situations that make your blood boil requires an inner fortitude few possess. Composure does not mean indifference. On the contrary, a composed person feels pain, anger, even humiliation, but they don't allow themselves to react instinctively. They choose to respond with wisdom. That is why the author of the book calls this the courage of a sage. I remember once on a bus, a young man stood in the middle, cursing, waving his arms, and no one dared to speak up. But then an old man stood up, walked closer, and simply said one sentence: "If your mother heard you cursing like that, wouldn't she be sad?" The whole bus fell silent. The young man was flustered. His mouth still wanted to retort, but his feet had already stepped back. That old man didn't yell, wasn't angry, didn't need to assert dominance, just a timely and appropriate sentence. That is the power of composed courage. But how does one acquire that composure? Is it innate? Or is it developed through practice, experience, tasting enough bitterness in life to understand that sometimes doing nothing is the most appropriate action? To be composed, one must first train the mind. And training the mind cannot be done by simply reading books or meditating for one morning. It is a long journey, starting from observing oneself in every smallest reaction. From seeing oneself annoyed when jostled, angry when misunderstood, sad when forgotten, and learning not to let those emotions control you. It's like standing in the midst of ocean waves without being swept away. Not because you don't see the waves, but because you know how to stay afloat. Once, when someone unjustly scolded me, instead of immediately retorting, I stepped back and listened to see if there was any truth to it. Mostly, there wasn't. But sometimes I found a grain of truth, and by choosing silence, I maintained my clarity and avoided a meaningless argument. A composed person is not always silent. They only speak when their words can create something positive. Otherwise, they maintain silence as a way to protect their integrity. People often mistake courage for aggression, but aggression is a reaction. True courage, however, is a choice, and to have the power of choice, one must train. If composure is the foundation, then understanding is the brick and stone to build courage. One can only be stable if one knows what one stands upon. Understanding that the person scolding you is suffering. Understanding that venomous words often spring from a wounded soul. Understanding that everyone has an invisible battle they can't fully see. And from that understanding, you don't react, don't get angry, don't retaliate. Not because you are weak, but because you understand, and from understanding, compassion arises. And compassion is what makes the courage of a sage entirely different from the courage of crude individuals. Noisy people are often the weakest because they cannot endure silence. Silence forces them to confront themselves, naked and alone, without roles, without an audience. The courage of a sage lies precisely there. They can remain at peace with the truth, even an unpleasant truth, and not feel diminished by it. I once witnessed a close friend go bankrupt from being a business owner with over 200 employees. He lost everything in just 6 months due to a financial blow. I thought he would collapse, go mad, or disappear from society. But no, he silently withdrew, blaming no one, complaining nothing, writing no bitter social media posts. A year later, I met him again, working as an assistant in a carpentry workshop. I asked, "Does it hurt?" He nodded. I asked, "Are you ashamed?" He smiled and said, "I used to be, but now I feel light because I didn't do anything wrong, I just lost." The way he nodded sent shivers down my spine, not because he was strong, but because he accepted the truth without resistance. That is a higher form of composure. Not suppressing emotions to look good, but truly digesting the pain so it no longer controls you. People with this courage don't avoid pain, they look directly at it, and by looking directly, they overcome it. Those who scream are trying to run from the pain, not knowing that this very act pulls them back. Composure, if it merely stops at staying calm, it's not enough. Composure needs reason to guide it. It needs self-understanding, something very few people truly possess. I once thought I knew myself well, but then, after being heavily criticized online, I lost sleep for several nights. I thought I was stable, but it turned out my heart was still full of fragility. That moment helped me understand something painful yet liberating. I wasn't the person I thought I was. And from then on, I began a journey to confront my true self, not with light, but with the courage to step into the darkness. The I that often reacted wasn't because I was offended, but because I was too attached to a certain image of myself. The more polished that image, the more fragile it was, and I feared others seeing the naked truth behind that facade. So I lashed out, not to defend truth, but to protect my own illusion. The courage of a sage is daring to let go of that illusion, daring not to need to appear smart, not to need to be right, not to need to prove anything. Because they understand that truth needs no adornment, no support, it stands on its own. And one who lives with the truth, even the truth they once feared, is a free person. That courage never comes from outside. No one can bestow it upon you. No advice is strong enough to make you change if you don't genuinely want to. It only comes after you've been through failure, humiliation, loneliness, betrayal, and yet still don't let those things darken your heart. How to cultivate that courage? I don't have a quick answer, I only know it starts with ceasing to run, with pausing in the moment you most want to react and asking one question. Is this reaction truly me or just a habitual reflex? Most of the time, we aren't living, we are just reacting. Someone insults us, we react. Someone praises us, we react. We have money, we're happy. We lose money, we're sad. As if we are an external control button, anyone can press it. The one with the courage of a sage is the one who dares to cut that control wire. They no longer give anyone the right to define them. They don't let external circumstances dictate their inner state. And that very thing makes them dangerous. Dangerous in the sense that they no longer fear losing anything because they know what is real and what is fake. Not fearing anything is ignorance. But later I understood that it's the peak of wisdom when you fear the right things, fearing becoming someone who is no longer yourself. And you no longer fear the trivial things society uses to intimidate. Losing reputation, status, money. Once I saw an old man sitting in the middle of a bustling market, amidst car horns, delivery people shouting, children screaming. He sat still, not swept away by anything around him. His gaze didn't fix on anything particular but was unusually deep, as if he was listening to a very subtle music that others couldn't hear. I stood watching him for a long time, and at that moment I realized composure isn't just silence. Composure is a very unique sound, an inner melody. Those who possess that profound courage rarely speak of courage. They don't call themselves brave. They don't boast about overcoming any major challenges. They remain silent as if the greatest trials have been swallowed whole in silence, fully digested, leaving no trace. I once met such a person, a street vendor. She sat in a corner of the market, selling bunches of vegetables, eggplants, for just enough to live. But I noticed she never complained, never snapped at customers, never raised her voice. Every word was gentle, every gaze warm. I curiously asked her, "How can you always be so cheerful?" She just smiled. "Life is hard, but I'm not suffering. Suffering comes from wanting what you don't have, but me, I don't want anything at all, just enough to eat, sleep well, and harm no one." After hearing that, I remained silent all day. People always think courage requires something grand. But I began to see that courage is sometimes just the ability not to complain in the most complain-worthy situations, to be able to smile when others expect you to cry out, to keep your heart upright when the world around you is distorted. I call that the courage of everyday life. Courage that needs no stage, no fanfare, no witnesses. It only needs a heart warm enough not to freeze and a mind clear enough not to go mad. Speaking of cultivating inner energy, I began to understand why the ancients valued composure so much. Not because it's beautiful, but because it conserves life energy. A hot-tempered person will spend their entire life on useless confrontations. A person easily offended won't have enough vital energy to do great things. Meanwhile, a person who knows how to guard their mind like guarding their breath will accumulate inner strength like a stream collecting water. True composure doesn't weaken you. On the contrary, it makes you stronger, but with a strength that isn't obvious like a tree root. The more silently it penetrates deep into the earth, the more firmly it can stand in a storm. Composed people are the same. They don't make a fuss, but their inner strength permeates the atmosphere. There are people who just sit there, say nothing, and yet others feel safe in their presence. I once sat next to such a person during a very tense meeting. He didn't say a word, but his gaze calmed everyone down. Later, I learned he had experienced 3 bankruptcies. It seems that courage, vital energy, and stillness are 3 things tightly bound together. You cannot have one without the other too. To have courage, one must have vital energy. To have vital energy, one must have stillness. And stillness must be cultivated. No one is born with it. I used to think stillness was natural, but the more I lived, the more I saw that stillness is a skill, an art of living that only those brave enough to face themselves can master. Then, regarding attitude and gestures, I realized not to underestimate the small details, because the tiniest things a gaze, how one stands, the tone of voice most authentically reflect our inner self. I was startled to realize how many times I thought I was composed, but my eyes were evasive. How many times I thought I was speaking correctly, but my voice carried insecurity. I began to observe myself more closely. Every step, every handshake, every moment waiting at a red light. Composure is not about doing things slowly, but about doing everything consciously. Even lifting a cup of tea can demonstrate steadiness if the mind isn't distracted. I remember once speaking with a Zen master. He recounted, "When I was young, I used to gesticulate when I spoke. Later, I practiced speaking without raising my hands, not to restrain myself, but to test. If I only used my words, would they be persuasive enough? If I didn't use my hands, feet, or face, would my mind be clear enough?" That statement made me pause for a long time, and ever since, I also began to practice doing less but more clearly. Then came politeness, and I perceived something many people neglect today. Politeness isn't social etiquette but a means to protect composure. An impolite person easily loses themselves, because when we are impolite, we are often falling into a zone of negative emotions. Contempt, anger, haste. While politeness, even just a bow or a respectful address, helps us pause, regain our rhythm, and thus maintain calm. I used to think politeness was merely a formality. But then, living in a society increasingly lacking in mutual respect from words to glances, I saw that politeness is the most subtle way to remind each other that we are human. And as humans, we must maintain a respectful distance to avoid harming one another with words or attitudes. And finally, preparing for the unexpected. I feel as if everything is pulling us back to reality because life is ultimately a series of surprises. The person who smiles at us today might turn their back tomorrow. What we thought we had surely grasped can vanish in an afternoon. And those surprises, if we're not mentally prepared, will knock us down in mere seconds. But those who have trained their minds, who are accustomed to living with composure, when the unexpected arrives, they don't flounder. They might be startled but don't collapse. They might feel pain but not panic, because they have cultivated the habit of pausing before reacting. An extremely essential life skill in this era. Speaking of the influence of circumstances, at first, I thought I already understood that. Who isn't affected by circumstances? The way the surrounding environment, from the pace of life, colors, sounds, to the attitudes of others, infiltrates us like fog, making us change without realizing it. Those near rude people easily become harsh. Those living in a hurried society easily lose patience. Those accustomed to hearing criticism easily lose self-confidence. Reading those seemingly simple statements sent shivers down my spine, because I recalled many periods in my life when I changed, not for any grand ideal, but simply by being swept along by the pace of life, the behaviors, and the standards of others. I once lived in a bustling city where everyone was busy, everyone was in a hurry, everyone used their phone like a shield to avoid real contact. And I, despite once loving tranquility, also became quick to speak, hasty to eat, late to sleep, and forgot how to listen. That's why the author advises us to establish a harmonious rhythm for life. Rhythm is not a schedule, but a harmony between body and mind. A person who works 8 hours a day but still maintains a peaceful spirit, undisturbed by speed, is one who has created their own harmonious rhythm. I began to practice this with seemingly very small actions. Pausing for 3 seconds before replying to a message. Eating more slowly, even if just for half a minute per meal. Washing my hands without thinking about the next task, and especially choosing to be alone for a little while each day, even if just for 15 minutes. Turning off my phone, sitting and listening to the wind blow, or watching a speck of light on the wall. Those small things gradually restored the inner strength I had lost during years of living too fast. Composure, courage, wisdom. All of it begins with very ordinary choices, but repeated with high awareness. To have rhythm, there must be a center. Like a wheel without a hub, the spokes will be distorted. Humans are the same. If there is no anchor point in the heart, even with a well-planned schedule, life will still be chaotic. And that anchor point is self-understanding. Most of my anxiety, impulsiveness, or impatience didn't come from circumstances, but from not knowing who I was, what I wanted, or what I feared. And because I was unclear, I was easily influenced by external things: strangers' words, acquaintances' successes, my own failures. Observe yourself like an outsider when angry. Observe the anger. When happy, observe the joy. Don't cling to emotions as if they are you. Because emotions change by the hour, by the minute. If you cling to them, you will drift with the waves. But if you stand on the shore, you will see that waves are just waves. And when you observe long enough, a day will come when you no longer need to restrain yourself, because inside you, it will be as still as a lake. That is the highest state of courage. No need to strain. No need to hide, no need to fight, simply as stable as a mountain. A strong person is not someone who never falls, but someone who falls and then gets up without complaining. But after reading this far, I want to rephrase it. A strong person is someone who isn't afraid to fall. Because they know that each time they fall, they get closer to their true self. And the courage of a sage, ultimately, is not an ornament, nor a privilege of someone special. It is something that anyone, if sincere enough with themselves, brave enough to look into their own darkness, can achieve. And once achieved, even living in the hustle and bustle of life, you can still walk with quiet serenity as if every step is placed on an invisible yet solid ground. The ground of a mind as steadfast as the sky. There are days when I feel adrift and disconnected. My mind is no different from an evening market, noisy, chaotic. No one listens to anyone, no one can control anything. At that time, I pondered, if someone could step inside my head, they would immediately flee. And I, living with that mind every day, only wanted to run. But where to? By chance, I once read the story of Koji, a Japanese man who was physically weak from childhood, with no significant strength. But after many years of practicing meditation, he became a wise man, not only healthy, but also with an incredibly clear inner mind. I was half believing, half doubting. How could simply sitting still transform both body and soul? The motivation for this method is not to achieve anything specific, but to return to humanity's original nature. A state of complete stillness, not forced. That struck something very deep within me. From childhood to adulthood, I was always taught to look outwards, to achieve goals, attain accomplishments, meet expectations. No one had ever taught me how to return inward, so I tried. Koji said, kneel back straight. Place both hands in your lap, no stretching, no pressing, just hold your body like an unmoving mountain without tensing. I followed. The first time, I only lasted 3 minutes before my knees ached, my legs went numb, my shoulders tensed. I scolded myself, only 3 minutes and already complaining. But then I suddenly remembered he didn't say I had to succeed immediately. He only said to be persistent. I returned the next day, and the day after that, following the breathing instructions. Must use the diaphragm, not to force, not to push, not to hold, so that the breath flows through like a wisp of smoke. At first, I didn't believe why breath was so important, but when I focused on it, I realized my mind refused to stay still. Every time I tried to follow my breath, a thought would intrude. From somewhere I didn't know, I tried to push it away, and then 2 more thoughts popped up. And that's when I understood that the problem wasn't the thoughts, but my resistance to them. It was the effort to control that made me more chaotic. I let go. Just watched them come and go. No interference, and like a simple magic, they began to dissolve on their own. Koji said, during meditation, there will be bodily fluctuations. Don't panic. That's not illness, not a bad reaction. It's a sign that vital energy is flowing, the body is self-regulating. I also experienced that. Sometimes my body swayed gently like small waves, sometimes my heart beat strongly, then became peaceful again. No need to analyze, just observe. I let myself be like a riverbank, water flowing past, holding onto nothing. But what touched me most was how he described the state of mind during meditation. No expectations, no searching, no forcing oneself to achieve anything, just being there like a tree standing in the forest, needing no one to see, no one to understand. I had never had a feeling like that. Because my whole life, everything was goal-oriented. Studying to pass, speaking to be praised, living to achieve something. But now, it's just living. I remember one morning, after almost 2 weeks of regular practice, I sat down as usual. But that day, for a very brief moment, I no longer felt myself sitting. There was no room, no bird song outside the window, just a very gentle, very subtle, yet very real presence. It didn't last long, just a few seconds, but when I left my seat, I felt as if I had been cleansed from within. I didn't tell anyone about it, not out of shyness, but because I knew that feeling couldn't be described in words, like a scent only the one who smells it knows. From then on, I didn't meditate to be healthy, to be wise, or to be successful. I meditated because I remembered that moment when I was no longer pulled by anything. No fear, no desire, no straining. And then I understood why Koji asserted that those who practice meditation long enough will possess a very different demeanor. Not noisy, not impressive. But wherever they are present, there is quietness, there is peace. Without lecturing, they make others want to listen. Without intervening, they make everything calm down. They are people who have conquered the chaos within, and thus are no longer controlled by external chaos. The courage of a sage, which has been mentioned throughout the book, turns out not to be cultivated through debate, philosophy, or persuasion, but through sitting quietly with oneself every day. After emerging from those first meditation sessions, I felt like someone who had just recovered from a fever. My shirt was damp with sweat, my heart still fluttering, but my mind had begun to clear. And then, I suddenly wanted to find something concise, profound enough to anchor my mind in a constantly fluctuating life. I coincidentally read a collection of maxims extracted from Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic Roman emperor. I didn't expect much, just thought these would be some familiar quotes. But then, upon reading the first sentence, I felt stopped in my tracks. If you know that your thoughts can encompass the entire universe, why should you grieve over trivial criticisms? That sentence didn't speak of morality, didn't advise, didn't admonish. It simply opened up such a vast perspective that the small matters I used to worry about suddenly seemed ridiculous. How many times had I been angry because of misunderstandings, because others didn't acknowledge my worth, because of an insensitive remark? But if I compared those things to a vast universe where I am but a speck of dust, then ultimately, it was all just the reaction of an immature ego. Marcus Aurelius didn't say anything new, he merely reiterated profound truths we often forget. Like when he wrote, "Beside the stream it is cursed, yet it still flows clear and pure. Keep your mind like that stream." That's not a poetic image, it's a way of life. Live like water, contact everything but retain nothing, not tainted by hatred, judgment, resentment. I started writing down those maxims in my notebook, not to memorize them, but to have a refuge whenever my mind got carried away. There were some sentences I read every morning, like others drink coffee, such as, "The wise don't need praise to live rightly. The foolish only live rightly when witnessed." I used to live like that fool, diligently doing good to be recognized, behaving more kindly when observed, and I told myself it was normal. Everyone's like that. But then I understood that true courage is doing the right thing even when no one knows, because then you act not for reward, but for the alignment between thought and action. Reading the line, "Remember that others can impede your actions, but no one can impede your thoughts if you don't surrender them." Most of my suffering didn't come from others' actions, but from my relinquishing sovereignty over my own mind. I let a single sentence make me lose sleep. Let a glance make me doubt myself. I held the key, opened the door for others to enter my mind, and then complained that I was hurt. Marcus Aurelius didn't write long passages. Each sentence was just a few words, but its power lay in the way it made me feel ashamed for having lived so superficially for so long. It was like a small bell in a noisy street, not screaming, but whoever listened would be startled. There was a line that brought tears to my eyes. "Live as if you had died and been reborn. Then you will find time more precious." I had wasted many days doing things I didn't believe in, spent hours maintaining relationships merely out of habit. I didn't see time passing, I only felt tired. But when I read that sentence, if I had truly died, if yesterday was my last day, how would I live today? Perhaps I would speak less, judge less, be more grateful, and not waste a single second being angry over something meaningless. And the sentence after that was like a final blow. Death is not to be feared. What is to be feared is living as if you have never truly lived. I don't know how many more years I can live fully. But from that moment, I began to choose to live less concerned with perception and more with my true presence. As I say this, I don't think I'll be drawn into a dialogue, because from the beginning of this story, I've become accustomed to a deep, evocative, one-sided narrative. The courage of a sage, as presented by the author, is somewhat overly abstract, leaning towards forbearance and composure, easily mistaken for passivity or disengagement. He writes, "In a turbulent era like today, might someone who is too composed be seen as indifferent or avoiding responsibility?" I nodded to myself silently. That question isn't easy to answer, because I too sometimes wondered, is too much composure weakness? Is too much patience being easily taken advantage of? Does remaining silent amidst gossip allow the truth to be buried? Composure is not an action, but action in awareness, not controlled by momentary emotions. This sentence was like a sword cutting straight through the fog of my doubt. Because I suddenly understood that the courage he spoke of from beginning to end was not about refusing to act, but about refusing to act when the mind is not clear enough. We live in an era where reaction is seen as a sign of character. Whoever reacts quickly, retaliates swiftly, responds strongly is seen as having personality and fortitude. But very few ask where that reaction comes from clarity or from unhealed wounds. Courage is not in daring to react, but in daring to choose not to react, knowing that such a reaction will lead to nothing good. I don't write for anyone to believe. I only write so as not to betray the things I have lived through. I stop there, because perhaps everyone who has ever held a pen and still possesses a conscience will empathize with those words. I had written lines I didn't believe, said things I hadn't lived, used words to satisfy a desire to be admired rather than to convey something true. And because of that, I understand the feeling of betraying oneself. It's not loud, but it smolders and lasts. The courage I speak of is a courage with compassion, not the impulsive courage of fighting, arguing, winning, or losing, but the courage of a person who remains calm enough not to harm others, even when they themselves are in pain. That courage, in this noisy and envious age, is a very brave gentleness. Thank you for taking the time to listen to the entire journey of the courage of a sage. If you have accompanied me to these final lines, I believe it's not because you are seeking some lesson, but because somewhere within you, just like in me, there is a very human longing. How to live more rightly? Not noisy yet steadfast, not ostentatious yet clear. We are living in an era where all values are pushed to extreme boundaries. Either win very quickly or disappear cleanly. In that vortex, composure becomes a luxury, silence is mistaken for weakness, and courage, if it doesn't take the form of fierce expression, is often overlooked. These books, and perhaps even the passages I've recounted, are only trying to suggest one thing: there is a kind of courage that needs no proof. A kind of strength that lies not in noise, but in opportune absence. It doesn't defeat anyone, but it defeats the chaotic parts within oneself. If you feel something has been stirred, however slightly a train of thought, a deep breath, a minute's pause amidst a familiar reaction, please leave me a comment, not for praise or criticism, but so I know there's someone else out there sharing these reflections. You don't need to agree with everything, just say something true, what you see or don't see. Sincerity is always more valuable than applause. And if you have a book that you always thought, I wish someone would recount this differently, more deeply, more truly, less superficially, please send me your suggestions. I want to try telling stories that others are hesitant to open up. Because sometimes the quietest things are precisely what are waiting to be heard in a language that doesn't need to shout. Thank you for listening. Now, goodbye and see you again.